I'm really excited to have this opportunity to introduce you to the Reverend Dr. Robert Shore-Goss, who, as you may know already, is a retired UCC clergyman and a theologian, now living in the Orlando area. He's here today, among many other reasons. He authored the resolution that was affirmed and sent by the UCC New Hampshire Conference to General Synod, which is beginning, I guess, a week from tomorrow already. Dr. Bob has served on the UCC Environmental Justice Council and is the author of God is Green and The Insurgency of the Spirit. He has a doctorate in comparative religions, specializing in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism and Christian theology from Harvard. So with that and much more, Dr. Bob, we are really excited to have your wisdom and passion with us today. So I turn it over to you. If perhaps you'd like others to introduce themselves as well, I'll leave that for you.
I'm not a usual UCC pastor. I self-identify as a Buddhist Christian with very strong animist leanings. I pastored a church in North Hollywood, which affiliated with the UCC, and became the first Creation Justice Church in 2015 of the denomination, and then later served on the Environmental Justice Council, the denomination still do, and worked to help a few churches to become Creation Justice churches, and one in particular, the Federated Church. I retired and followed my husband, who was pastor there. The Federated Church in Marlborough is kind of a unique church. It is a UCC, Methodist, and Unitarian Universalist church that affiliated together in 1927, before anything. It was just kind of pioneering. And it became the first Creation Justice Church in New Hampshire for the UCC. I got put into not only teaching Bible study by my husband for the congregation, but also leading the Green team to keep me busy while I was writing. One of the things that happened before COVID was I presented to the Green team of the Federated Church, and they were really very activist group. They had just secured putting 80 solar panels on the community hall, and were really kind of reducing their carbon footprint. And those are all good things. And they were looking for doing something else. And I said, my research in a book that's coming out in October, this was pre-COVID, there's an interesting thing happening, and that is, I want to talk about the rights of nature. And I explained that the rights of nature is something that has been percolating for a number of years. It has been, I would say, it started with the colonizations of the Americas, when indigenous peoples fought not only for their lands, but also to fight against the genocide of settler colonialism. One of the things that I said was that in studying, and for the book, The Insurgency of the Spirit, I was looking at land as gift and the Hebrew Bible, and how that land was basically seized through Roman colonization and a taxation system and tithing system that led peasants to get into spiraling indebtedness, and through spiraling indebtedness, not unable to pay, the temple could seize their lands and sell them. And so what happened that in the Hebrew Bible, land was seen as a gift. It could not be sold. It was basically seen as a gift to the family, almost like renting in some ways. But when they lost roots with land, it was really a traumatic experience for the family, and traumatic in the sense of losing connection to divine gift. That same very similar pattern I found with indigenous peoples. They understand that land is a gift of the spirit. The only distinction is that indigenous peoples understand that land and nature are kindred. They're part of the kinship structure. I learned about 3 months ago in a webinar when an indigenous woman said, you know, when we introduce ourselves by the land and water that we live by, because water is life. And that made sense suddenly, that when Standing Rock said, basically the cry was water is life. And so certainly I started thinking about what happened at Standing Rock was a real connection, that civil rights, human rights, and environmental rights were brought together and really took forefront. But it had been percolating through indigenous peoples around the world. Part of that started not only in resistance to corporations, and one of the things that I guess many of you probably also are aware of, that the Hobby Lobby decision by the Supreme Court gave corporations the rights of a person. And one of the things that started in the 1972 by a professor at University of Southern California, wrote an article, who was going to speak for the trees? It comes from the Lorax. And so the title of the resolution is, who will speak for the trees? So I started putting this together, and I brought documentation on this and wrote up as a theologian, wrote 15 pages up, and basically the green team at the Federated Church said, no, too long, cut it back. So I cut it back to about 9 pages and submitted it to the conference in New Hampshire, and COVID hit. And I thought, boy, we're not going to get anywhere with this at this point in time. There were other priorities. Churches were shutting down, and we're in a state of crisis in terms of really surviving during COVID. But the conference minister said, let's go forward with this, and presented it to the conference council. And they vetted it and said, we want to send it to the annual meeting in October of 2020. It was voted and affirmed by 99% to send it to the Synod. In the meantime, my own anxiety level that one conference might not have been enough, I started really working with other churches. And if we got 5 or 6 churches independently to support it, that it would certainly go to the Synod. And so I worked on that, and we got about 8 or 9 churches that basically have endorsed it, as well as recently, several weeks ago, Penn Central Conference also affirmed it. And so we're going into the Synod with a certain amount of strength at this point in time. The Environmental Justice Council supported it, and a working group, which I belong to, which is the Eco-Theology Working Group of the Environmental Justice Council, decided they wanted to take a very proactive thing. So they designed a paper, 2-page count, to endorse that and send it basically to the conference ministers, and asking that it be forwarded to each delegate. And so that has been forwarded at this point in time. I think we're in a good position for this. Now, why this? Worldwide, indigenous peoples have started to fight back by saying that corporations and governments have overstepped their boundaries in terms of exploiting nature recklessly and harming. So what happened in the last 2 decades is that New Zealand, the Maori, basically said, we want to protect major rivers, the Wangari River in New Zealand, and forced it into the Constitution of New Zealand, that that river has protection, constitutional protection of a person. The same thing has happened in Ecuador. Again, indigenous peoples have pushed for it. In Bolivia, Colombia, with parts of the Amazon, and in terms of Australia, as well as in the United States, a number of indigenous nations, First Nations, have that as part of the Constitution, but also municipalities have adopted it. And very close to home, there were 3 townships in New Hampshire that adopted that as a town ordinance to prevent fracking and pollution of waters. You folks in Florida passed Amendment 1 in Orange County in November, which said that the rivers of Orange County had a right not to be polluted. So there's a great deal of movement that has developed around this in terms of really kind of using this as a strategy to kind of deflect the reckless harm being done to nature. And I think that it raises a question for us that as I talk to various groups, legal groups that have evolved, like the Center for Environmental Legal Defense Fund in Washington State, I discovered that one of their folks in Ohio spearheaded the biotic rights of Lake Erie. Why would you need to have the biotic rights of Lake Erie? Well, large agribusiness basically dumps all its fertilizer waste into Lake Erie. And it gets to the point that Toledo as a city could not drink the water or use the water for bathing. So there was an ordinance passed. Instantly after it was passed, the large agribusiness concerns basically forced and coerced the Attorney General to put a stop to it, a halt on it, an injunction. Well, that has also been appealed, and there's been an appeal case on this about a month ago, appealing this. The biotic rights of Lake Toledo, Lake Erie is really, I think, an important sort of document that has now been duplicated in France. They've taken that text and they're duplicating. What I'm trying to say is that when I discovered, and I had a kind of private sort of tutorial with the Center for Environmental Legal Defense Fund, one of the things that they have been testifying and setting up ballot initiatives and defenses for environmental rights is that oftentimes Christianity, and especially Christian churches, are basically taking the position of corporations over nature. And I thought, boy, here is an opportunity for the UCC to be the first Protestant polity to publicly declare that nature needs legal rights and protections. And so building on that, but I have to kind of footnote that Pope Francis I, when he spoke to the United Nations in 2015, he argued that there needs to be protections and rights of the environment. So he's there. Maybe not all the Catholic bishops are, but he is there as well. And certainly outside the US, there are Catholic bishops working on the rights of nature. In the US, there are pockets that are taking place that are working in the Unitarian Universalists and the Episcopal Church that are working on the rights of nature. I see that this would be a statement first to work in defending nature, because we are in a situation of escalating climate change. If you haven't listened to the news today and look at the temperatures in the West and in the East Coast, and that Canada in Vancouver reached 121 degrees yesterday, unheard of. When we see sea level rise taking place, then we see also devastation to biodiversity and extinction moving on. We find ourselves in a situation where we are losing the war to save the earth and life.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, please.
At this time? I just want to say one thing. I heard on BBC News the other night, Bill Gates said that if climate change is not dealt with by the end of the century, what we will be experiencing in this world and in this country is 5 times the what we have experienced in the pandemic. And not only that, those of us who are here in Florida, Neil and myself, I'm a retired pastor in Florida, nobody will even be able to live in Florida in another 70 to 75 years. And what that means is, because it will be so hot that it will not be habitable. Florida will no longer be. And that's something that I personally feel. My late husband was a Lakota Sioux, part Lakota Sioux. So as you're saying this about indigenous people, I personally would like that put in the resolution, that people have a handle on how serious this really is. I don't think people do. And when I heard that from him, the project, I don't need to go into this moment because this is your floor, and I would like to share this during this time together though. It got me going that, yeah, I have to follow through on the project that I originally started.
I agree with you 100%. I was shocked 4 years ago, excuse me, when I was on a panel at Cal State Northridge and representing the religious voice on environmental change. And afterwards, a scientist from the United Emirates, she came forward and said, you know, last summer, there was one whole week in the United Emirates where the average temperature was 163 degrees.
Yeah.
And that was shocking for me to hear that. And when we look at how climate change is affecting immigration patterns and the devastation of Syria, what is happening down in Central America and other places, basically both the heat and aridization, the loss of soil, it really is alarming. I read Bill Gates's book. I liked it in many ways.
What was the book title?
Oh, I don't remember. It's his latest book out, and it's on climate change. He basically wants to take a new operating system for the Earth and call it Green Operating System number 2, which I understand. But the problem is that it's not just a technical, scientific response to it. Yes, it's important. We throw in basically somewhere between 80 billion tons of carbon gases, methane, et cetera, into the atmosphere. And it means complete change of lifestyle. And I agree with him on that. However, it also requires something that I think that the moral voice of religious communities need to speak about, which is the value of nature and the place that nature plays within our biblical heritage and our life as well. And we need to speak on the moral voice and offer the moral voice to this legal movement. I think it's absolutely critical. It is an important movement, as you said, in terms of habitation of Florida and other places around the world. Does that sort of address? I mean, and some of the specifics, I can't change the specific resolutions at this point in time because they're in concrete and they've been vetted, but they're written in such a way that it is expansive. And so in that regard, I would recommend looking at them at some point in time. And it also includes really reparations and aligning ourselves with Indigenous peoples in their struggles. David?
I appreciate this conversation so much. Part of my concern is two prongs. One is our General Synod is going to hopefully pass this and be definitive in our stance. But at a local level, the issue is what impacts are going to have on a congregation. Basically, denominational statements alienate people or other people go to sleep and pay no attention. It's a matter of what you do at a local level. So my first prong is what can a local church do? Yeah. And that's been part of my commitment of what we're doing at Windermere with a Native American spirituality group that has been in existence for going on 3 years now. And after COVID sort of subsided, we are now reactivating, and we now started putting Native American prayers in our services. We have an upcoming flute circle. We're talking, we have plans now to do the Native American arbor outside. We are hoping to do a blanket exercise like it's done in Canada and develop that for the state of Florida about the lost tribes and the lost lands in Florida.
That's wonderful.
The other prong is
Windermere is not far from Orlando, right?
It's just 25 or 30 miles west
I'll join your group. I'll
Yeah,
join-
and so we're in.
Me too. I would like to
County.
attend some of the meetings too.
Oh, would
to
love to
learn.
have you. That's
Yeah.
because that's
recommend-
what we're trying to do is build a coalition of people who are both part of Windermere Church, but also beyond that,
Yeah.
that we can actually have an impact. Because there's over 4,000 pure blood Native American people in Orlando, greater Orlando area. There's 71,000 Native American, not mixed blood, but pure blood Native Americans in Florida. We are the 12th biggest state as far as population, and yet we only have 2 tribes that are recognized by the federal government. And basically, what most people know about the Miccosukee and the Seminoles is they have casinos. Where are the voices of Native people? Where are they? I've done a census study for all the communities around Orlando, so I can tell you how many people live in Ocoee or in Altamont Springs or wherever it is, Poinciana. Poinciana has over 500 Native American people.
That's, you know,
And where are their voices?
yeah, and I'll 2 points I'll bring out because they're pertinent. One is I will recommend that you read my book, The Insurgency of the Spirit, because it really argues that there is an animist liberation point of view of the historical earth-loving Jesus that is overlaps with indigenous animist traditions. And I bring that out from the wilderness spirituality and quest that Jesus has as a vision quest, and read it from a Choctaw perspective. I do other things too in that regard, but that's beside the point. Your first point is absolutely critical to me, which is the question is that the Synod has about 20 sort of environmental basic resolutions, and they're finally put together on the UCC environmental website. And in talking to one group of folks, one of the pastors from Philadelphia area said, we passed these, but what relevance is there? How are you going to implement it? And I said, okay, you're right. I'm not just basically saying that we have to just state this publicly, and I think there will be some bearing and prophetic witness to it and impact upon other polities and denominations. But I have proposed there are 3 areas that it affects. One is we have to set up a communications group, affinity group of folks who are going to be working with, like, the Center for Environmental Legal Defense Fund. You should take a look at their site. And the latest campaigns they have, one is on the Universal Declaration of Wetlands, freedom of wetlands. And so that's one that I'd like to see us work on. But others are, let's work on the campaigns to basically defend nature. They've come out on a campaign and asking for prosecution in Ohio of the dumping of toxic and radioactive waste into the rivers of Ohio, that the companies be prosecuted. I agree with them on that. So working with closely aligned, and here in Florida, in Orlando, at Barry University, that was set up by Sister Pat Siemens, and who is basically the Earth Justice Center. We got to, I think, work with them a little more closely at this point in time, and tap into the Catholic working group on this. Secondly, the UCC Environmental Justice Council is looking to align or basically partner with other organizations. And so they've narrowed it down to about 7 or 8. And several of those are like the Environmental Indigenous Network, which I'm for that, Pipeline 3. But I say we cannot use the word partnership because we're not on equal basis with Indigenous peoples. We have to go in humbly to support and not take over. That's colonization. And I said, we must study and learn. A number of my colleagues flew up to be at the pipeline protest last week. And I support what they're doing there. but they're not taking over. And I think that's important. And I also pointed out, and Jim Antel, who's been basically the conference minister in retirement from Massachusetts, who's been very active in environmental issues, jumped on what I said, is that if this resolution is passed, it makes sense that we are basically in alignment with the values of Indigenous peoples, justice values. And so I say, basically, this is an avenue for further alignment and support of Indigenous justice and causes on this. Third, and you're correct on the local level, how do we begin to do this? I have outlined the working and revamping of the creation justice church system to really green our services. I've got the Echo Theology group committed to working on developing a number of worship services through the year that could be, and resources for both preaching and incorporating into it. For instance, it would behoove, and maybe if I'm allowed to write something in time for September, a number of denominations have the season of creation. I'm not sure how many churches here in Florida are doing it. And that is 4 Sundays are dedicated to foreground creation in the biblical stories and so on. And the 5th Sunday is basically the blessing of animals of St. Francis. And it really has, it's being basically widely practiced from both Catholic and Orthodox, Lutheran, Episcopalians, Methodists, and so on. The UCC should be involved in it. And I know there are a number of churches, because I've celebrated it in every church I've participated for the last 6-7 years. And so that's one way. The third way is that we've got to basically, in this area of not only greening our churches and bringing nature into our worship and our sacramental life, because we're looking at issues of food when we celebrate Eucharist. Baptism is a question that we're talking about. Can we take the waters, local waters, and baptize our kids in them when they're polluted? And what does the church say and tradition says? Tradition says basically you can't use stale and unhealthy water to baptize and be a sacrament of health and abundance and life. So we can build a theology of our sacramental life that's connected to that. Doing worship outside. One of the things that is really important, and I've been working on, is I'm watching emergence of other sites. There's a spontaneous group called the Wild Church Network. Google it on Facebook and look it up. And also the Wilderness Seminary. Again, it's a program to train people how to use nature as part of their Christian spiritual practice. In addition, there is the tradition of Lectio Divina. I come out of a Catholic contemplative tradition. I'm a former Jesuit priest. And that is a tradition that goes back to the desert monastics that began to use the same tools of applying to scripture to nature. And so you can say that we can practice engagement with nature in a very mindful way, like Buddhist meditation of mindfulness, and we can also start to green our spiritualities as well. One of the pushback I've had on fellow clergy is when I say that basically we have to also think of environmental organizations as faith communities. Because if you talk to people in environmental organizations and you ask them how they got involved and why, and you listen to them, it is exactly kind of a faith journey and discovering a value of spirituality that is there. We come at green issues from a spirituality of connection with the earth to that center. And I think if we build greater cooperation with local communities and recognize that they have a valid spiritual practice of caring, and they find value in the earth and its nature, and they find a depth of meaning, boy, that's religion to me and spirituality. So there are lots of things we can do to kind of begin to this, and I think we need to do this. And lastly, the Environmental Justice Team in New Hampshire is working with the Horton Center, which is their summer camp for kids. And they're really working to get many of the UCC and non-UCC kids in there to really learn to fall in love with nature. I think if you read any email from me, I have basically a mantra at the bottom of my email. If you fall in love with God's earth, you'll fight for God's earth. And the Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson has a book called The Creation, and it's a letter to a Southern Baptist minister. And one of the things that he talks about it is that he's saying religion is a powerful force and science is a powerful force, and we can work together to care for the earth and save life. And he says one thing that we can do is to raise our kids to fall and care for the earth, to be naturalists, conservationists, to love the earth. I think that's an important thing that our summer camps can do.
Mhm.
That's so powerful to me, because it not only helps me kind of have a wider understanding of the benefit of moving from the territorialistic understanding of Christianity that I think is still, 60 years old, but still prevalent. But the other, even as when I grew up as an adolescent and teenager, the programs were sometimes shifting into caring for the environment, but it was a different type of obligation than that which comes from falling in love and appreciating and understanding the environment. It was the doomsday of putting a Band-Aid over it, but it wasn't getting down to the opportunities that have been passed on since the beginning of creation, was to be one with nature. And what does that look like?
And a very revolutionary thing I did with the North Hollywood, California church was that as we committed ourselves to be an inclusive church, we made the earth a member of our church. It's not a facetious thing, because we trained our pastoral team and they started asking questions. If we're pastorally caring for one another, what is our pastoral commitments for the earth? And that spread as a community. And we became a very central community that earth-centered issues were important. There was a gardening that developed there. And I'm doing a talk at the Episcopal Cathedral 2 Sundays from now in Austin on gardening as spiritual practice. It comes out of my book, God is Green. And I'll tell a story. There was a deacon who became one of my closest friends, Greg. He had been living with AIDS and cancer for years. He could count his T cells. There were like 80. He became the gardener. He was a deacon and a board member. And every day he was there taking care of the garden for 7, 8 years. And he cared. He was really very faithful. And one day we sat down and talked, and he said, I look at the garden as giving me life, and I've learned a lot. He said, it taught me how to listen to people, because as I listened to the garden and the needs of the plants, I learned how to listen to congregants. And I'm saying, exactly. And there is a connection by listening to nature that we can discover the spirit there. I want to claim a congregationalist, Emily Dickinson. And she skipped church often in summer months.
Yeah.
And she basically said that her garden was her church. And she heard actually better sermons in the garden than at church. And she said the only commandment she ever obeyed was look at the lilies of the field, listen to the lilies of the field. There is a garden spirituality that is not above, but it is dialogical, that you enter into as a relationship. There is a subjectivity there. There is an interconnection there. There is spirit that is there. And I think that's really moving in the direction that Indigenous peoples move, to find and discover that there is kinship there. There's a new book called plants as person. And there's a book that's absolutely fabulous called Loving Waters Across Religions. And it comes out of a student of Thomas Berry, who is one of my foremost heroes. And she basically argues for the subjectivity of water. And she looks at it from a Hindu perspective, Christian, and a Buddhist perspective. And she notes that Buddhism says that basically water is a bodhisattva, a compassionate, caring being that does and gives for the benefit of other beings. And it started getting me thinking about things. When I started using the Lorax title, Who's Going to Speak for the Trees, I've learned since then that there is a woman named who's a forest specialist scientist, Suzanne Synod. If you Google her name and ask the question, do trees speak? She's done a study on this, that trees not only speak, but they care for their saplings, that they communicate with their roots to other plants. And if there's a carbon or magnesium deficiency, because they're shaded, they give and share that with other trees.
Yeah, I think there's a YouTube. There's a YouTube.
Yeah, she does a
about
YouTube
it.
as well.
Yeah.
And she's got a book on this too. It's fascinating. And it says something about sentience, intelligence. And, you know, right now I'm grieving at the fires that we find in the western part of our country, killing and destroying trees. I think that recognizing the value of nature and how is absolutely critical to us, that we look at nature as siblings, that we are participants and not above nature. The problem is that we have separated ourselves from nature and we say, nature is there for our benefit and use solely, and we can do whatever we want to it. No.
I think I would like to interrupt you, Robert.
Certainly.
Yeah, so I want to share maybe 2 or 3 inputs from myself, like a little bit personal. So my name is Ngan Ling Long. I'm one of the ordained minister with the UCC Florida Conference. I myself is a ACPE educator. I train chaplains in the hospital. I'm also a church member of the First Congregational Church, Winter Park. So I'm so excited when I listen. David, you share about
we just joined the Winter Park Church, my husband and I. My husband is chaplain at Orlando Health.
Ah, yeah, good. Yeah. So
started,
actually, yeah, I'm happy to hear David, you talking about Windermere, about the group with indigenous people. That reminds me of a dream I have. I'm from Hong Kong. Hong Kong is my home city. I came to this country 2006 to Stanford Hospital to train as a CPE educator. Before I came to US, that means like 2006 or maybe 2005, I forgot exactly, but I did have a dream. I think it should be 2006. In the dream, I was in a rose garden with a native person. I don't know whether it's a Native American but I know that he is a native. He is an indigenous person. And I still remember he wear like a ponytail, right? Ponytail, and wear jeans. And he's leading me and showing me his roses in the garden. I still remember that dream. I just feel that now I'm working in this land, and I would love to be blessed by the people of this land. I mean, so that's why I'm so happy to hear from David that, there's a group going on in Windermere. Maybe, sometime in the near future, I can go to join I don't know, to join, to have this connection.
No, we might be ordaining echo chaplains too. I mean, there are some people describing themselves as echo chaplains. I see that there is groups like Matthew Fox has the Sacred Order of the Earth. There is Guardians of the Earth. I would love to have a training group of UCC folks to learn how to become shamans, which is to restore balance to the earth itself and people to the earth.
Yeah.
Through the practice of connecting with the earth and so on. I identify Jesus as a shaman.
Yeah. And also from time to time, also talk with trees. Of course, I'm not telling everybody that I'm talking with trees, but I do. I do. But so that I echo a lot of what to green our spirituality. I echo it.
Exactly. I mean, so you come out of a tradition. I don't know if there is a movement within Asian religious traditions and even Asian Christianity to recover some of the indigenous connections of Taoism and Buddhism, with including into the practice of Christianity in those cultures too. And I have a good friend of mine in Malaysia that has been doing that. And I don't know if you know Kwok Pui Lon. She is a Chinese post-colonial theologian.
Kwok Pui Lon.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Boston, in Massachusetts, I think.
No, she's actually at Emory University. I've spoken to her class.
Oh, now she's in Emory now?
Yeah, I think she's dean there now. I've spoken to her class. She's endorsed my book, The Insurgency of the Spirit.
Yeah. Actually, I was her teaching assistant for one summer semester when she returned to Hong Kong.
Okay.
Yeah, so, yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry getting digressed, but that's okay. Making connections is good here.
I think maybe Brooke want to speak, right?
I'd like to, as I said, my husband's part Lakota Sioux. And so we spent a lot of time integrating our faith in Jesus and using biblical narratives along with Lakota Sioux. In fact, our wedding and the birth of my daughter was all done with Native American flute music and everything. And his father would call these powwows in which the entire family would be gathered together. And he was really the head of the household in a way that was so powerful. So I can really relate to this, but I would like to very briefly share the work that he and I did before he died. I was called in nature. I was in nature at a Nazi concentration camp in Germany when I was younger, and that was where I was called. It was in nature, and it was a displaced persons camp for people who had come forth from the Nazi concentration camp. But I think we've got to be very careful, because I know a lot of people, like a friend of mine's sister is a Wiccan and they only go into nature. And I feel the importance of bringing this in with a biblical perspective and a Christian with Jesus, and then bringing it into nature. And that's what my husband and I did. And what we did before he died was, and I'll say it pretty briefly, is I live in Northport, Florida. It is the only town and I think it's so important that we not only get this from a theological perspective, but we get very practical and what people are really going to do. And what we were working on, and I have to get back to it, is Northport, Florida is the only town in all of Florida that does clear cutting. And what that means is when someone goes to develop a house, and I live in a very natural, a lot of wilderness. We have bobcat here. We have all sorts of wildlife, raccoon families. We have coyotes. We have a lot of wildlife here. And what they're doing is clear cutting. And what that means is instead of leaving the trees there, they clear cut everything out. And the law is there have to be 5 trees on the property. So what they're doing is they're putting 5 little sticks up afterwards, and these huge, huge, beautiful trees that are thousands and thousands of years old are being taken down. And what they're doing is they're putting these 5 sticks up, and there is a fine for doing this. We got the ordinance and everything. We went around and researched all the different companies that were doing this. And we took it And what they're doing is they're taking this and putting it in the overhead so that when they sell that property, a realtor of someone who's building a house there, they have to pay that extra. So they are getting off scot-free. So what we did, we took it to my godmother's husband. He has since died in his 90s, who was a retired attorney from Connecticut and worked a lot out of New York City. And he was a really tough guy. And he said, this is what you have to do. Not only do you have to see about people following the ordinance, and when they are not following that ordinance and that level of destructiveness is taking place, is you have to get yourself an environmental law attorney. You have to take them to court, and you have to make that retroactive from all those years that they have been doing that, so that you are squeezing them out financially, which means they have to abide and start keeping those trees up. And I think we can talk and we can talk and we can talk, but until we start getting practical and some of these things really start happening, it's just going to keep going like this. The other thing I wanted to say was one very simple thing is I am very much a part of the educated and the working class. The working class has no conception of what this is because they don't have the intellectual understanding of it. And when it is presented as 1 degree difference, they go, oh, it's cold out there in the middle of those snowstorms out there in New Hampshire, you know, in Massachusetts. They're not, it has to be interpreted in such a way. When scientists are saying, oh, 1 degree warmer, those people say this is a crock of bull. They don't get it because it's not presented. And until we can present it in such a way that people get it with the carbon emissions and what's going to happen to their homes and their kids and their families and their way of life, then, you know, they don't get this, that what's going on in California now. And this is what I'm saying. I think we need to develop ways in which this is affordable, like the Center for Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I know that CNN had grants for people trying to do this kind of work, but we need to get very, very specific of what a group is going to work on. And what we want to work on here in Northport is get clear cutting stopped. I mean, just stopped.
I think that's a worthwhile project and concrete. And that's kind of what David was asking in terms of concrete connections. I think if you have basically saying that nature is valuable and we're not above nature, but we are part of nature, we are citizens of nature, then we have to say that basically there's a value there and we will fight for that. But I think that, you know, on a sort of mega sort of structure, getting this passed, I think will have some effects, but then we have to concretize it. One other thing is that I'm not against Wicca. It's a different spirituality, but we share some things because in our Bible, there is basically a very strong earth-centered spirituality there. I teach Bible study from a creation-centered spirituality, both testaments, and I find an earth-loving Jesus really caring for the earth and caring for people.
We need to bring that in more.
I'm doing a workshop. Neil recruited me for the annual gathering on the earth-loving Jesus and how to preach. So I'm specific on that. And also, I'm hoping that we will start to develop a green environmental group. When I came here, Brooks Burnt, who is the environmental justice minister, I asked him about Florida because I knew nothing about it except my family was living down here. And he said he had talked to John Vertigan, and John was hoping to bring back a environmental justice team. And I came down here and I raised my hand with John and said, I'd like to participate in that process. So I'm going to be part of that and work with Neil on this and others, and hopefully we can resurrect it and really kind of begin to resource and learn to take the resources of Windermere and other places and share those with one another and really build an connections of the conference on these issues.
We also need monies. We need monies if we're going to start taking some of these people to court.
Well, we don't have the monies, but we have capital. And what we have as capital is the moral voice of spirituality and the Bible on this. And that's where the Center for Environmental Legal Defense Fund said, would you have someone be able to speak for nature as opposed to against nature? That a number of Christian churches do so. And I said, yes, we do. We will. And so I think those are important. David, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know that our time's gonna run out here pretty soon, Neil, right?
Well,
And-
it's your time. I'll be on, but yeah, I'm mindful. But please continue.
Okay, I'm concerned that that the six of us are but a small group of what needs to happen, and I'm concerned that when we're done here, we don't maintain connections, that we don't find ways to invite other people into this, particularly those who can speak with a voice of authenticity as indigenous people. What do we do that silences all these 17,000 Native American people in Florida? What do we do that silences them in providing leadership? That's a question that I struggle with a great deal. I'm a part of, my wife and I support the Native American, the Lakota Law Project, and we're very much committed to what's happening up there in the Dakotas and areas like that, with pipeline number 3 and Keystone's finally been shut down. But my concern is here in Florida, what can we do? And I do believe that if I'm successful, I've already written the script for a blanket exercise. And if you aren't familiar with a blanket exercise, get online and look it up, what they've done in Canada as a result of they had 800 people in front of the Parliament in Ottawa participate in a blanket exercise in 2016. And it's a very moving experience of coming to terms with land loss of Native Indigenous people. And the fact that there's some communities, some religious organizations in the states that are doing this, I want to see that happen here in Florida over the loss of land of Native people, leaving only 2 tribes that are still here. And all the others are extinct or have been moved to Oklahoma or someplace. So we got a lot of work to do. And in this time, we're just scratching the surface of it. We need to go deeper. And so please connect with me, please. I invite you to participate in Windermere because we meet once a month, usually on a Saturday morning, but we're doing things others. One of the other things we're having happen by fall is a giveaway, Lakota type giveaway, or potlatch, as some people call it in the West Coast. So we'll be doing that as a part of a worship service. We just had this past week. My totem is a dragonfly, and I have had a lot of spiritual experiences with dragonflies visitations, and 2 of them. I have one back here on the wall behind me that came to me while I was working at Disney World in costume. It came to me 3 times and finally died right next to my shoulder. And it's over here in his shadow box. But I've had 2 others come and die right at my feet. And I had a service this past week in which we buried those 2 in my garden with smudging and prayers and so forth, as part of their gift to humanity, to us as human beings, and particularly their gift to me as they spoke to me. So please, I invite you to connect and stay connected with me.
Forgive me for sounding, David, and forgive me for kind of passionately moving so quickly after your sharing. I don't want to step on the weight of that. And I apologize in advance for what might be a cliche UCC answer by saying, well, let's form a team. That's a great problem. Let's form a team. But I do want to say that it is with full intentionality that these conversations become more intentional under the auspices of what this conference has already declared 4 years ago. It might have been 5 years ago, that we are a creation care justice conference. So it isn't our intention to have just the one conversation today. And it is our intention to be more intentionally connecting. And I think identifying other churches in our conference that self-identify first as creation care churches. Coral Gables, Tampa, I'm sure there are others, but those are 2 that come to mind. Yeah, Lakewood, UCC as well, I think. And the hope, and I think you raised a couple of points, and some of that also has, there's no silo just environmental ministry. There's no silo just anti-racism ministry. There's no silo youth ministry, because, with our emerging generations, having these conversations is urgent, necessary. And I think, culturally, that might be an even easier task in some senses, because it's becoming more commonplace in other settings. But some of the ideas of the people that we've othered and the people that we've silenced are things that other ministry teams in the conference are talking about. So without trying to be territorial, and without trying to just start another committee, I would invite you to share with the team that you're referencing in your church, the worshiping community, with the intention of beginning in the few months to put some momentum behind and identifying team of people that want to continually meet to not only be responsive to things that come up, and then, so what is our voice? And as Bob has mentioned, as people of faith, unfortunately, we're outnumbered even in our own homes, so to speak, in terms of people speaking for or against the environment, but also to be thinking strategically, both for resources for local churches and longer term plans in terms of how we can organize throughout Florida for change.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of creativity that's come from here today that I welcome. There's an indigenous, I'm not sure, affinity group within the Environmental Justice Council. I'm not sure how active that is, but one of the members is from Hawaii, pastor there. And basically they've been fighting against the taking of native lands to put a huge, build a big astronomical sort of observatory there on indigenous lands without consulting them or allowing the peoples to visit the land. So they've won at this point in time the right to be a voice there. There are indigenous peoples in California that are concerned about their families back on islands in Samoa and so on. We heard the congregational minister, head minister from Tuvalu, which is about 24 miles of land of 8 islands. Altogether, it's 24 square miles that's sinking. And basically dealing with the fact that their culture is going to basically be destroyed and they're going to be dispersed. And people are asking, why is God destroying us by water as sea level rise? God promised that that would not happen. And his response is, God is not doing it, it's human beings doing it.
That's right.
And they broke off relationships with the United States when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. So Samoans are part of our church too. And there are indigenous peoples and folks on reservations that the UCC is working with too. So, I mean, we have a lot of materials that we have the beginnings for grassroots work on this. You might want to write up something for the pollinator. If any of you are not familiar with the pollinator, it's a UCC monthly organ that comes out. It's not big. It has a few articles and keeps you abreast what's happening. You could write something about the blanket exercise, 500 words in that to get that out to other peoples. There are lots of folks in the UCC that are interested in indigenous spirituality. So we can begin to make those connections that I think will cross-fertilize ourselves. And we can also learn from indigenous peoples, invite the folks in to kind of speak about their spirituality. We can learn, read. There's a lot of resources.
You mentioned a while ago gardening and that type of thing, and we have one of our members is a I forget, she's not a shaman, but she has written in gardening. She's trained as a Seneca protector of spirituality, and she's a part of our group. So we're very much committed to that. And her name is Melinda Joy Miller. and she's an author about spirituality and gardening and so forth. So
What's her name? I'm sorry.
Melinda Joy Miller. She lives in Leesburg. So she's a part of our group, she and her husband.
Yeah.
So I think she's Cherokee, but she's trained by a spiritual shaman of Seneca.
I use Stephen Charleston, who is an Episcopal bishop. He was a president of Episcopal Divinity School, and he has the 4 vision quests of Jesus. That's really excellent.
Yeah, I read it. Yeah, my second Bible is Wisdom and Power by Fool's Crow. Frank Fool's Crow is my spiritual guide. So that's my second Bible. So
I need to go now. I'm sorry. And good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Me too. Bye. I wanted to say one more thing. You know, I don't know, Jim and Sandy Bowler. It's kind of interesting because the tribe that my husband's family, I mean, he was part Lakota Sioux, don't get me wrong, but they were from in South Dakota. Her father was principal of the school of that same group. And so they've had a lot of work with that. And my brother, before he died, all the monies from his memorial we gave to the Black Hills Alliance, which was also with them. So there are people here, you know, I think Sandy is a really good resource because she was raised there, you know.
Yeah. Neil, can I get the emails of all the participants today? Because there are resources, like there's an environmental justice webinar that was recorded, Nick Estes, on Standing Rock, and one that just came out with a group of clergy and a indigenous person for Pipeline 3 and so on, that I could get out to folks here for them to look at. Yeah. There are some books that I would even recommend, and resources. I want to resource every person.
Sure. If you all would leave your emails in the chat, I'll take responsibility for organizing that, and I'll send it to you, Bob, with the link to today's conversation.
I sent you an email some time ago, Bob. I don't know, about a week ago or so. I sent you an email, so you might already have mine. I'm not sure.
I don't have it. Mine is Rev.
Dr. I remember seeing that you were going to do this, so I sent you an email anticipating this. So maybe it didn't get through.
Maybe it didn't get through, but
okay. All right.
I'll get yours and I'll send it out too.
All right. You're going to take care of that, Neil. You'll get everybody's emails.
Yes. If you'll put it in the chat, I'll organize it into an email thread.
I'm challenged when it comes to computers. So.
Okay. If you gave it to me now, I'll put it in.
It's my last name spelled back, Laesuoh. Laesuohd.
Yes.
House seal spelled backwards, David.
Okay.
Laesuohd 39 at gmail.com.
Okay.
By the way, Bob, I think one of the other things too is understanding and embracing two-spirit people, which is part of Native American spirituality. So,
so you don't know, I'm one of the architects of queer theology. So
yeah, okay. So
I may be not officially two-spirited, but I'm part of that movement. But yeah, that's I'm aware of that too, and and I will have to say that at Standing Rock, the LGBTQ water protectors were right at the front of the encampment, and they were out there along with the women and really taking a very active role. The conference minister, which I'll make available to you, in New Hampshire, Gordon Rankin gave a talk at a youth summit, which is recorded, and I've used it for classes and seminary, on his experience at Standing Rock and basically colonization as environmental racism. So, I mean, there are resources I've been putting together for the UCC and giving them. So I'd like to resource some of you on keeping this alive.
I appreciate this, Robert.